When someone mentions the name Marvelous Marvin Hagler, you probably picture one of the greatest middleweights of all time. He's got the middleweight division, as you know, pretty well wrapped up. He's got no competition in it. His brutal wars made him a legend. But his final fight, the one outside the ring, was his most tragic because in the end, it wasn't a punch that took everything from him. It was injustice, betrayal, and a decision that never stopped haunting him. And when he finally found peace, one unexpected twist ripped it all away, in the most controversial way imaginable. This is the story of how it all happened, the greatest midways of all time, and one of the greatest southpaw of all time. We all remember the era of the four kings Hagler, Hearns, Leonard, and Duran. Four legends, for warriors, all competing in one of the greatest eras boxing has ever seen. It was a glorious time. They didn't hide behind promoters or worrying about protecting their records. They just fought. And Marvelous Marvin Hagler was every bit their equal. But unlike the others, he had to fight for everything. Respect, opportunities, even recognition as a champion. And even when he ruled the middleweight division, he felt the world never truly gave him the respect he deserved. Then came his greatest betrayal. His defeat to Sugar Ray Leonard didn't just cost him his title. It sent his life into a spiral: alcohol, drugs, violence. The man who once had everything was suddenly lost. Most people don't know this side of Hagler's story. So to understand why that loss hit him so hard, we have to go right back to the streets of New York, where he learned to fight, long before he ever stepped into a ring. Marvelous Marvin Hagler had a tough start in life. Born the eldest of 6 siblings, he grew up in a cramped tenement building in a black neighborhood of Newark, Central Ward, raised by a single mother, doing everything she could to keep the family afloat. Life was already a fight. And then came the moment that changed everything. The 1960s in Newark were a powder keg, a city where racial tensions simmered under the surface, ready to explode. Black families were locked out of jobs, housing, and opportunities, while a white-run government controlled a city where white people were now the minority. The community was frustrated, angry, and then the match was lit. A black cab driver was pulled over and beaten by police. That was all it took for the city to erupt. Sound familiar? Yeah. Cops killing black people isn't new. For 3 days, Newark became a war zone. And in the middle of the chaos, the young Marvin Hagler, along with his mother and siblings, were trapped in their apartment. They spent the whole time laying on the floor, not daring to stand up, because standing up could mean getting shot. And then it happened. Bullets smashed through their window and embedded themselves into the wall, right where their heads would have been. This wasn't just a close call. This was survival. Following the riots, his mother had seen enough. She packed up her family and moved them to Brockton, Massachusetts, where Hagler would spend the rest of his childhood years. But while his body left New York, his mind never did. That burning sense of racial injustice raged inside him for the rest of his life. And one day he would step into a boxing ring, not just to fight but to prove he was stronger than the forces that tried to keep him down from an early age. He knew exactly what he wanted. His mother thought he might become a social worker because of his sensitive side, or maybe even a dancer or a comedian. But little Marvin only had one dream: boxing. The first time he ever put on gloves was at the age of 10 years old, when a social worker he knew only as Mr. Joe handed him a pair, and from that moment, he was hooked. He grew up pretending to be Floyd Patterson, telling his mother, "I'm going to be rich just like him one day. I'm going to buy you a house." But dreaming was one thing. Survival was another. After his family moved to Brockton, the young Hagler took the next step toward his dream. But before he ever stepped into a boxing gym, life gave him a brutal lesson. One day when he was about 15, he got into a street fight with Darnell Wigfall, a name young Marvin would never forget. Wigfall didn't just beat him up, he humiliated him. He took his pride. Then, to make matters worse, he even took his jacket. Hagler went home that night embarrassed, angry and burning with injustice. And that's when he made a decision. He was determined to learn how to fight. But when he entered the gym, nobody even looked at him. For an entire week, he showed up and not a single person spoke to him. So he left to a different gym. And that's when he found Pat and Goody Petronelli, two Italian-American brothers, former boxers themselves who would become his trainers, his managers, and his guides for the rest of his life. Coming from the background, he didn't trust white people. But somehow the Petronellis gradually earned his trust. And under their guidance, Hagler quickly made a name for himself. As an amateur, he didn't just have potential. He was a problem. He racked up a dominant 55-1 amateur record. And his breakout moment came when he won the National Amateur Athletic Union 165-pound title. In doing so, he was voted fighter of the tournament, ahead of two future legends, Aaron Pryor, a future two-time light heavyweight champion, and Leon Spinks, the man who would go on to defeat Muhammad Ali in one of boxing's greatest upsets. That's how good he already was. And yet when he turned pro at 19 years old, despite his obvious talent, boxing still wouldn't give him a fair shake. More than ever, Hagler felt as though the whole world was against him. He was winning fights, dominating opponents, proving himself at every turn. And still no big opportunities came. Early in his career, he notched up to notable wins and a draw against Olympic gold medalist Sugar Ray Seales, and then he got a shot at redemption. Remember Darnell Wigfall, the guy who humiliated him as a teenager? Hagler didn't just fight him twice. He beat him twice. The second of these victories came by way of an 8th-round knockout. And knowing how driven he was by injustices, you can probably imagine how satisfying that was. Hagler took his first loss against Bobby Bugaloo Watts in his 27th fight. But his biggest test came 2 fights later, when he took on Willie the Worm Monroe on just 2 weeks' notice, with barely any time to prepare. Hagler lost, but the fight was close, and Monroe gave him something even better than a victory. He gave him a rematch, and this time Hagler destroyed him. That fight marked the beginning of an 11-year winning run that only ended under the most controversial circumstances in the final fight of his career. But we'll get to that soon enough. Even after avenging his loss to Monroe, Hagler still couldn't get his shot. Fight after fight, he kept proving himself, taking on the toughest guys no one else wanted to fight. Roy Jones Sr. No. 1 contender. Mike Colbert, whose jaw he broke. Kevin Finnegan, who needed 40 stitches in his face after the fight. And Bad Benny Briscoe. Hagler was doing everything right. And still, he wasn't given his first shot at the middleweight title until his 50th fight. 50 fights. That could only have reinforced what he had known. All along he was never treated fairly. Not in life, not in boxing. And when his title shot finally came, he was ready to make the sport pay for every year it had ignored him. In a story that Hagler often liked to tell, Joe Frazier once told him that he had 3 strikes against him, that he was black, a southpaw, and he was good. And that's why it was so hard to get meaningful fights. For years he was shut out. But then finally, legendary boxing promoter Bob Arum took notice. And finally Hagler got his shot. Caesar's Palace, Las Vegas. Across the ring stood the rugged Italian-American boxer Vito Antuofermo. Hagler dominated. Most people watching thought he had done enough. But to everyone's surprise, when the scorecards were read, a draw, Hagler could hardly believe it. Despite putting in a performance that should have crowned him the new middleweight world champion, Antuofermo kept his belts, and what made it even worse, he was so sure of his position in the fight that he took his foot off the gas towards the end. Had he gone for the kill, the belts would have been his. But there was no time for self-pity. Hagler knew how the world worked by now. Complain and nothing changes. Keep winning, and they can't ignore you forever. He wouldn't have to wait long for another shot. After Vito lost his titles to British boxer Alan Minter, and then beat Vito again in a rematch, Minter made his second defense against Hagler, and this time he refused to be denied. The fight took place at Wembley Arena, London, in front of a hostile, overwhelmingly pro-Minter crowd. And yet the bout itself pure destruction. Minter, who had always been prone to cuts, was a bloody mess by the third round, for nasty cuts poured blood down his face. As the referee stopped the action, the ringside doctor took one quick glance. It was over at long last. Marvelous Marvin Hagler was the middleweight champion of the world, but instead of the celebration he had dreamed of, the arena erupted in rage. Beer bottles, glasses, chairs, they rained down on the ring as the crowd began to riot. Hagler's corner men and local police quickly formed a human shield around him as they rushed him out of the ring. In yet another case of injustice that he always seemed to find himself facing, Hagler was robbed of his triumph. There would be no belts placed around his waist, no victory speech, no moment of glory. Instead, he was forced to flee as his limo outside was smashed to pieces. Some say Alan Minter brought this reaction on himself. Before the bout, he made one thing clear: no black man is going to take my title. He claimed those words were partly a response to Hagler's refusal to shake his hand when they were introduced, and in another instance Kevin Finnegan claimed to have been similarly refused a handshake on the same night, with Hagler telling him he didn't touch white flesh. But whether it was meant as a racist remark or just a response to Hagler's cold demeanor, it poured fuel on an already dangerous fire, and the flames fully ignited. That night in Wembley Arena, to this day, it remains one of the ugliest moments in boxing history. Even in victory, boxing found a way to deny him his moment. But if they thought this would break him, they didn't know Marvelous Marvin Hagler. He didn't just want the belt. He wanted to make sure no one could ever take it from him. And over the next few years, that's exactly what he did. In a later interview, Hagler showed a lighter side to his character. When asked how he felt about fighting abroad, he smirked and said, "I never fought broads. I have too much respect for them." It was a rare glimpse of humor from a man who had spent his entire life fighting against the odds. But by this point he had grown a thick skin. Injustice didn't break him. It fueled him with his brutal destruction of Alan Minter. Hagler's reign as undisputed middleweight champion officially began finally. He was a mainstream superstar, and one by one, he dismantled every challenger put in front of him. Mustafa Hamsho, William Caveman Lee, and even Roberto Duran, another of the so-called four kings, the legendary Hands of Stone, became the first challenger to take him to the full 15 rounds. Duran's durability surprised many. No one had ever taken Hagler the distance as champion, but the message was clear. You could last with him, you just couldn't beat him. His next defense came against Argentina's Juan Rodin, and in the very first round, for the first and only time in his career, he went down. But was it a clean knockdown? Not according to Hagler. He insisted Rodin had thrown him to the canvas. Either way, it didn't matter, because once he was back on his feet, he spent the next 9 rounds punishing Rodin, until the ref mercifully stepped in. And then, after a second defense against Hamsho, came that fight Hagler hearns about, initially billed as the fight, or as it would later be called, the war of fight that would go down in boxing folklore as one of the most explosive, violent, and exciting bouts of all time. Many believed Tommy Hernandez would be the man to take down Hagler. The hitman was stepping up in weight, but he brought serious firepower, 30 knockouts, a height and reach advantage, and a devastating punch that had left a trail of broken opponents. Most expected Hearns to box Hagler from a distance, to use his reach, his speed, his precision, but that's not what happened. That's not what happened at all. From the first bell, Hagler charged forward like he had a point to prove. Herrings met him in the center of the ring, and all hell broke loose. This wasn't boxing. This was war. Hearns caught Hagler early on with a shot. Flush to the chin, he staggered back, but only for a second. Then he did what he always did. He kept coming. walking through everything Hearns could throw at him. The bell rang with both men battered, with Hagler bleeding from a cut to his head. Then came round 3 by now. Blood was pouring from his forehead. The referee called time, bringing in the ringside doctor. Was the fight about to be stopped? Was he about to lose everything because of a cut? The doctor gave the signal he was good to go. And that was all Hagler needed to hear. He went after Hearns. Like a man who refused to be denied, he unleashed a huge right hand that stunned him, then followed up with a barrage of punches. Before crushing him with one final right hand, Hearns collapsed to the canvas. Marvelous Marvin Hagler had won the war. And in just 8 minutes, he had cemented his place in boxing history. Hagler fought for everything he had ever earned. And once he became undisputed middleweight champion, he refused to let it go. His reign was the second longest of the 20th century, built on discipline, suffering, and pure will. Before each fight, he disappeared to Cape Cod, calling it jail, fresh sparring partners every round, running in army boots, because training shoes are for sissies, and total isolation, staring at the cold, hard sea alone with his thoughts. And yet, even as he suffered, success brought new challenges. One of boxing's most memorable quotes was when he said, "It's tough to get out of bed to do road work at 5 a.m. when you've been sleeping in silk pajamas." But that's exactly what he did every single time. Because he wasn't just fighting opponents, he was fighting to keep what he had spent a lifetime earning. Nevertheless, perhaps starting with his fight against Roland, whispers began to spread. Was Marvelous Marvin Hagler slowing down? It wasn't just fans and analysts asking the questions. Sugar Ray Leonard was watching too. And despite considering retirement, he was tempted into facing Leonard by the promise of a big payday. But if he thought this fight was going to be on his terms, he was dead wrong. In the negotiations for the fight, Hagler agreed to Leonard's demands. That stacked the deck in his favor. A bigger ring, 10-ounce gloves, and 12 rounds instead of 15, limiting his time to break Leonard down. And yet Hagler was still confident. After all, Leonard had been semi-retired for most of the last 6 years. He believed he was catching him at the right time. But what he didn't know, while Hagler was winding down, Leonard was secretly sharpening his blade. Instead of just sparring, Leonard held private full-on fights behind closed doors. No cameras, no distractions. Just real grueling wars to shake off the rust. So when he stepped into the ring that night, Leonard was sharper than anyone expected, including Hagler. The fight itself was a clash of styles and mindsets, and the points decision delivered at the end of it remains one of the most contentious results in boxing history. To this day, Leonard ran. Hagler chased. Leonard flurried. Hagler pressed forward at times. Hagler could be heard barking at Leonard, shouting, "Come on, little bitch," trying to lure him into a real fight. But Leonard wasn't biting. And as we all know, when the final bell rang, the scorecards left the boxing world divided. The punch stats will tell you that Leonard threw more and landed more, but did that tell the whole story? Not according to Hagler. He always claimed Leonard created an illusion with his boxing, trading power for speed, flicking flashy combinations that looked impressive, but never actually did damage. He also believed that because he had knocked out almost all of his opponents during his reign as champ, Leonard was given extra credit just for staying in there until the final bell. And when the final decision was announced, Leonard had taken his belts, or as Hagler saw it, they had been stolen from him. In a life full of injustice, this was the one that would haunt him most, the one that drove his life into a downward spiral. And from that moment on, he was never the same. Losing his belts was bad enough. Losing them like that ate him alive. But what made it even worse? Who had taken them? For his entire life, he had been fighting for recognition. Ignored at his first gym. Forced to wait 50 fights for a title shot. Robbed against onto a fair mo. There were even the beer bottles that rained down on him and denied him of his moment of glory. And the whole time, the lack of recognition. he felt he received from the boxing media and fight fans. He had done everything the hard way. And then there was Sugar Ray Leonard, the golden boy, the media darling, the star. Leonard had always been treated as royalty, while Hagler had been treated as an afterthought. Leonard got the big paydays, the adoring fans. He got the respect Hagler had spent years bleeding for. And now Leonard had taken his belts too. It burned Hagler to his core. He didn't just resent the judges. He blamed the Petronellis, his longtime trainers, for sending him out with the wrong tactics. But worse than that, he took it out on his wife. After the fight, Hagler became a different man. Distant, cold. He was an emotional wreck, and spent his days sulking and crying. And then came the final blow. The week before the fight, while he was in camp, he received the news that his mother-in-law had died. He was close to her. He wanted to be there for his wife. But boxing came first. He stayed in camp. He missed the funeral, and the guilt followed him into the ring. After the loss to Leonard, his whole world was falling apart. He began drinking heavily. There were even whispers of cocaine use. And then one night it all boiled over. In the middle of an argument with his wife, Hagler snapped. He threw her out of the house. And in the heat of the moment, he pushed her and smashed their car with a rock. She immediately contacted a high-profile divorce lawyer. In the end, she never followed through with the case. But the damage was done. Their marriage was over, Hagler later claimed. The split had nothing to do with the Leonard defeat. But if we're being honest, losing that night didn't just cost him his belt. It cost him his family too. In the aftermath, Hagler wanted revenge. He desperately pursued a rematch. But Leonard dodged him. Time passed, and he eventually walked away from the sport for good. He moved to Italy, remarried, learned Italian, and even had moderate success as an actor in Italian films. And then after all that time, Leonard finally came calling. He offered Hagler a lucrative rematch. But by then he had moved on. He had found peace, and so the rematch never happened. That should have been the end of the story. But it wasn't. Because at just 66 years old, marvelous Marvin Hagler died unexpectedly. And his sudden death was surrounded by controversy. Although he spent most of his time in Milan, Italy, Hagler also had a home in New Hampshire. It was during one of his stays there that he unexpectedly fell ill. And before anyone could even process what had happened, the news broke: Marvin Hagler was gone. Then out of nowhere, Tommy Hernandez, his old adversary, made an Instagram post and all hell broke loose. Remember, this was when the pandemic was winding down, and conspiracy theories about the vaccine were running wild. In a now infamous Instagram post, Hernandez claimed Hagler had died from complications caused by the vaccine. The online boxing community and all the conspiracy theorists went into meltdown. And here's the thing, Hearns had no evidence. None. Now look, this is one of those never meet your heroes moments. And we're sorry to say it, but the great Tommy Hernandez really embarrassed himself with that post. Let's not get into a ridiculous discussion about whether the COVID vaccine was a giant conspiracy by some kind of world government, or whatever else you want to claim. But when Herbert wrote that Hagler was in ICU, fighting the after effects of the vaccine, he outed himself as a bit of a tinfoil hat wearer. The backlash was so bad that Hagler's wife and son had to make public statements confirming that he had not died from any vaccine-related issues. In fact, it's not even clear if Hagler had been vaccinated at all. As strangers, we're not entitled to his personal life, so we'll never actually know the real truth behind his sudden passing besides natural causes, which gives some weirdos reason to go rampant. But having such wild and trivial rumors circulating after he passed is an insult to his name. He deserved better than to have his death turned into a conspiracy theory. And so Marvin Hagler was taken away too soon. But his incredible legacy remains. He always felt underappreciated, so much so that he legally changed his name to Marvelous Marvin Hagler, just to force broadcasters to acknowledge it. And honestly, can you blame him? He was always convinced the whole world was against him, and his experiences of growing up in New York and living through the riot allowed him to go to dark places in the ring that most men wouldn't dare venture, and still emerge victorious on the other side. Today he is rightly regarded as one of the greatest middleweights of all time, and his place in the pantheon of boxing legends is secure. His fight against Hearns in particular will never be forgotten, along with many of the other gripping nights he gave us. How do you remember Hagler? Was he underappreciated during his time? Or do you think he just always had a bit of chip on his shoulder? And what do you think about the controversy surrounding his death? We know you've got plenty to say about all of this, so drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell before you go. See you in the next one.